When wealthy investor Mr. Harlan sneered across the candlelit dinner table, "She's just a slave girl," he had no idea those 4 words would ignite the most scandalous fight in Louisiana history. Thomas Bell's shocking response, "That's my future wife," sent shockwaves through the plantation elite. But what happened next would expose decades of forged documents, illegal slave trading, and a hidden family secret that could destroy everything. As the storm clouds gathered that fateful night in 1853, Maria clutched the faded blue ribbon at her wrist, unaware that buried in the Bell family Bible lay proof of a freedom that had been hers all along, if she could stay alive long enough to claim it. But with the ruthless overseer Pike plotting to ship her downriver by sunrise, and a mysterious manumission document that could change everything, Maria was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth. The courtroom showdown that followed would test whether love could triumph over law, whether mercy could defeat greed, and whether a young woman's sharp eye for detail could expose the lies that had enslaved an entire community. If you're watching this incredible true story, subscribe and tell me what city you're from. I want to know where justice still matters. Steam curled from the biscuit tins in the plantation kitchen as thunder pressed low over the Louisiana cypress. Maria hummed a low hymn under her breath, tying the faded blue ribbon at her wrist with careful fingers. The cotton thread had worn thin from daily knots, but she wound it each morning the same way her grandmother had taught her 3 loops, a tuck and a whispered prayer. "Lord knows that storm's been hanging all week," muttered Bessie from the hearth, turning strips of bacon with a wooden fork. Grease popped in the iron skillet. "Feel it in my bones like winter." Maria nodded but kept her humming soft. The melody carried better when it stayed quiet, threading through the kitchen sounds like water through stones. Outside, the morning bell clanged from the overseer's quarters, sharp and demanding. Heavy boots clumped down the back stairs. Thomas Bell appeared in the doorway, his brown hair still mussed from sleep, holding an empty glass bottle to the lamplight. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, the look of a man fighting demons in his sleep. "Maria," he said, voice hoarse, "can you read this Latin again? The doctor's script on Mother's tonic." She set down her wooden spoon and took the bottle. The glass was smooth and cool against her palms. "Valeriana officinalis," she read aloud, each syllable clear. "Tres goutte in aqua, pro somno tranquillo." 3 drops in water for peaceful sleep. "How do you do that?" Thomas asked, wonder creeping into his voice. "Remember every word like it was written in your mind?" Before Maria could answer, Pike's shadow filled the doorframe. The overseer's leather boots were already caked with mud, though the sun hadn't burned through the morning mist. His pale eyes moved from the bottle to Maria's face. "Parrot tricks won't pay your mother's debts," Pike said, voice flat as old iron. "Or keep this place running when she's gone." Thomas straightened, and Maria saw his hands clench. The young master had been drinking less since his mother took sick, but the shaking hadn't left his fingers yet. "My mother's not gone," Thomas said. Pike shrugged, already turning away. "Evening supper's set for 7. That investment man from New Orleans wants to see the books. Best wear something that don't smell like the quarters." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the bacon's sizzle. Maria moved back to the biscuits, but she felt the weight of Thomas's stare and the sharp edge of Pike's warning. The overseer kept his own ledger, she knew. She'd seen him writing in it by lamplight, marking names and prices in neat columns. "Maria," Bessie said when Pike's boots faded toward the fields, "you best stay in the kitchen tonight." No serving at table, but Maria had already heard the dinner guest's name whispered among the house staff. Mr. Harlan from New Orleans, who bought whole families like cattle lots and shipped them downriver on barges. She touched her blue ribbon and hummed 3 more bars of the hymn, letting the melody settle her breathing. Thomas lingered by the window, watching Pike stride toward the quarters, where the field hands were gathering for morning assignments. Rain began to patter on the tin roof. "Storm's coming," he said. Maria nodded, though she kept her eyes on the rising biscuits. "Always does this time of year." But she could feel something else pressing in, heavier than weather, darker than clouds. The way Pike had said "when she's gone" instead of "if." The way Thomas's hands shook when he spoke of his mother. The way her own blue ribbon seemed to tighten at her wrist like a warning. "Best get those biscuits out," Bessie said. "Bell ring soon for the morning meal." Maria pulled the tin from the oven, the heat washing over her face. The biscuits were golden and firm, their tops split in neat lines. She arranged them in the basket with a clean cloth, the way she'd been taught since she was small enough to stand on a stool to reach the counter. Thomas was still by the window when she looked up. "Thomas," she said quietly, using the name he'd asked her to call him when no one else was listening. "You remember that story in the family Bible, the one about debts forgiven?" His head turned. "What about it?" "Sometimes mercy paid forward comes back when you need it most." He studied her face, and she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of hope, or maybe just curiosity. Then the dinner bell clanged from the main house, and the moment broke. "7 o'clock?" Thomas said. "Wish me luck." Mariah watched him walk toward the house, shoulders set against the rain that had begun in earnest. She touched her ribbon again and hummed the hymn's final verse, the one about safe harbors and morning light. The storm was coming, but she'd weathered storms before. By candlelight that night, the spoons went still when the rich guest laughed. Mariah stood beside the sideboard in the dining room, hands folded, trying to make herself invisible. She wasn't supposed to be there. Bessie had been clear about staying in the kitchen, but Mrs. Bell had taken a bad turn after supper, and someone needed to bring fresh candles when the storm knocked out the oil lamps. The dining room flickered with amber light. Silver gleamed on the mahogany table where Thomas sat across from Mr. Harlan, a thick man with pomaded hair and rings on 3 fingers. Pike occupied the chair at the table's foot, his ledger open beside his plate. "Remarkable property," Harlan was saying, cutting his beef with precise motions. "Though I confess I'm curious about your labor efficiency. That girl there," he gestured with his knife toward Mariah. "She seems bright enough, but what's her actual value?" "Market's flooded with house slaves right now." Thomas set down his fork. "Mariah isn't for sale." "Oh, everything's for sale, my boy." Harlan laughed, a sound like grease in a hot pan. "Matter of price. Though I suppose she's pretty enough in that dusky way. Good breeding potential, if the bloodline's clean." The candle flames wavered in the sudden silence. "Mrs. Bell's shallow breathing was audible from the parlor, where she lay on the horsehair sofa. "You misunderstand," Thomas said, his voice carrying new weight. "Mariah isn't for sale because she belongs to herself." Pike's head snapped up from his ledger. Harlan's knife paused halfway to his mouth. "Belongs to herself?" Harlan chuckled. "My dear boy, you've been reading too many abolitionist tracts. She's just a slave girl." Thomas Bell stood. The chair scraped against the wooden floor like a thunder crack. His hands were steady now, Mariah noticed. Steady as the oak beams overhead. "That's my future wife." The words dropped into the room like stones into deep water. Harlan's mouth fell open. Pike's ledger slammed shut. A fork clinked against china as someone's hand went slack. Mariah felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, though she didn't move. The blue ribbon at her wrist seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. Through the parlor door, Mrs. Bell's breathing caught and settled. "Thomas," Pike said, his voice deadly quiet, "you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking perfectly clearly." Thomas looked directly at Mariah for the first time that evening. "I made a promise. I intend to keep it." Harlan recovered first, his laugh sharp as breaking glass. "Well, this is rich. The young master's gone soft on his property. Thomas, boy, you can't marry chattel. It's not legal, not moral, and certainly not profitable. We'll see about that." Pike's chair scraped back. "This conversation is over. The girl goes back to the quarters. Now," but Thomas stepped between Pike and Mariah, his body a wall of determination. "No, she stays where I can protect her." "Protect her from what?" Harlan asked, amusement dancing in his eyes. "From men who think human beings can be bought and sold like tobacco." The storm chose that moment to rattle the windows, rain driving hard against the glass. Lightning illuminated the room in stark white, and in that flash, Mariah saw Pike's hand move to the knife at his belt. "Thomas," she said quietly, the first words she'd spoken in the dining room, "your mother needs her medicine." It was true, Mrs. Bell's breathing had turned ragged, but it was also an excuse to break the tension before it snapped into violence. Thomas heard both meanings and nodded. "This conversation isn't finished," he said to Harlan and Pike. "Oh, it's finished," Pike replied. "She'll be gone by sunrise. Already have a buyer lined up downriver." "Over my dead body," Pike smiled, cold as winter iron. "That can be arranged too." Mariah followed Thomas to the parlor, her legs unsteady. Behind them she heard Harlan's voice, low and calculating. "Pike, my friend, I believe we need to discuss new arrangements." In the parlor, Mrs. Bell lay pale as old linen, her breathing shallow and fast. Thomas knelt beside the sofa and took her hand. "Mother," he whispered, "I'm sorry." Mrs. Bell's eyes opened, fever bright but aware. She looked at Thomas, then at Mariah standing in the doorway. "The blue ribbon," she said, voice barely audible. "I remember. Your grandmother wore one just like it." Mariah's heart stopped. "You knew my grandmother?" "Sweet girl. Helped me through a terrible fever when I was carrying Thomas. Never forgot her kindness." Mrs. Bell's hand fluttered toward her son. "Some debts can only be paid with mercy." Thomas looked up at Mariah, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Mother, where would I find the old family papers? The ones from grandfather's time?" "Attic," Mrs. Bell breathed. "Cedar chest. Beneath the quilts." Judge Bell kept everything. Thunder rolled overhead like wagon wheels on cobblestone. In the dining room, chairs scraped and boots tramped toward the door as Harlan took his leave. Pike's voice carried through the walls. "Sunrise, I'll handle everything." Thomas stood and clasped Mariah's hand. "We need to find those papers." "Thomas," she whispered, "you don't understand what you've done. Pike will try," Thomas said. "But I meant what I said. Every word." Mariah looked down at their joined hands, his pale and soft from a gentleman's life, hers brown and calloused from kitchen work. The blue ribbon at her wrist caught the candlelight. "Your mother's right about mercy," she said. "Sometimes it comes back when you need it most." Outside, the storm was building to fury. But for the first time in her 19 years, Mariah felt something stronger than fear rising in her chest. It tasted like hope and sounded like promise. After the table cleared, the storm pressed low over the roof, and footsteps creaked toward the attic. The attic crawl space smelled of cedar and old prayers. Mariah held the candle steady while Thomas lifted quilts from the chest, each one releasing the scent of lavender and thyme. Rain drummed on the roof shingles just inches above their heads. "Here," Thomas said, pulling out a leather-wrapped bundle. "Father's papers. Haven't looked at these since I was a boy." Ephraim's grey head appeared at the top of the ladder. The old stable hand moved quiet as smoke, despite his 70 years. "Master Thomas, Pike's in the kitchen asking questions. Bessie told him the girl went to bed, but he's getting suspicious." Mariah unwrapped the leather carefully. Inside lay documents yellow with age, property deeds, bills of sale, correspondence in faded ink. Her fingers moved over the papers like she was reading Braille. "What are you looking for?" Thomas asked. "Something my grandmother told me once. Said Judge Bell was a fair man, paid his debts in mercy when he could." She lifted each page to the candlelight, scanning the margins where people often wrote their private thoughts. "Most of these are just land transfers," Thomas said. "Bills of lading, tax receipts." "Wait." Mariah's finger stopped on a page near the bottom of the pile. "This one's different. It was a copy of a bill of sale dated 1822, 31 years past. But in the margin, written in careful script so faint it was barely visible, were words that made Mariah's heart race. Debt of honor, paid, through mercy granted. In consideration of services rendered during the fever of 1821, and in recognition of Christian duty, I do hereby set free 1. Judith, aged 25, with the covenant that her line shall know freedom when the third generation comes of age, witnessed by my hand and seal this 15th day of October, in the year of our Lord 1822. Judge Samuel Bell. Below the words was a tiny seal, pressed into the paper with such delicate care it had escaped the notice of whoever had filed the document away. "Thomas," Mariah whispered, "this is about my grandmother, Judith. She saved your grandmother's life during the fever, and Judge Bell freed her." Thomas leaned closer, squinting at the faded script. "Third generation. That would be me." Mariah's voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I'm the third generation. Lord in heaven," Ephraim breathed from the ladder. "That's a manumission document, legal and binding if it can be proved." Below them, boots clomped across the kitchen floor. Pike's voice carried up through the house. "Where is she? I know she's here somewhere." "We need to go," Thomas said, rolling the paper carefully. "If Pike finds this, he won't just destroy it," Mariah said. "He'll destroy us too." Ephraim's weathered hand reached down to help Mariah onto the ladder. "There's an old root cellar behind the smokehouse. Pike don't know about it. We can hide there while we figure what to do." "No," Thomas said. "We're not hiding. We're going to prove this is real." "How?" Mariah asked. "The manumission mentions a seal and witnesses. If Judge Bell was careful enough to write it down, he would have recorded it somewhere official too." "The church ledger," Ephraim said suddenly. "Judge Bell was a deacon at First Baptist. They keep records of all legal matters involving church members." Pike's voice was closer now, coming up the main stairs. "Search every room. She's got to be here somewhere." They climbed down the ladder quick and quiet, Thomas tucking the document inside his shirt. Mariah blew out the candle and followed Ephraim through the servants' passage that connected the attic to the kitchen stairs. "We'll go to Pastor Amos," Thomas whispered. "He knew my grandfather, if anyone would remember." "Pastor Amos died 3 years back," Ephraim said, "but his son Jeremiah keeps the church records. Lives in the cottage behind the sanctuary." They reached the kitchen as Pike's boots thundered down the front hallway. Bessie stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup with deliberate calm. "Evening, Pike," she said without turning around. "Looking for something?" "The girl. I know she's here. Mariah went to bed an hour ago." Storms got everyone spooked. Pike's pale eyes swept the kitchen, lingering on the back door where rainwater puddled on the wooden floor. "Bed where?" "Quarters, where she belongs." Mariah pressed herself against the wall beside the pantry door, Thomas's hand warm on her shoulder. Through the window, lightning illuminated the path to the slave cabins, where Pike would surely search next. "We can't go to the quarters," she whispered. "No," Thomas agreed. "We go to the church. Tonight." Pike's boots scraped toward the door. "If you're lying to me, Bessie." "Been cooking in this kitchen 40 years, Bessie said, her voice steady as bedrock. "Never lied to a white man yet." "Too much trouble." The door slammed behind Pike, and they heard his boots splashing through puddles toward the quarters. In minutes, he'd discover Mariah's empty cabin and know Bessie had deceived him. "Back door," Ephraim urged. "We got maybe 10 minutes before he comes back." Thomas grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. Mariah pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, the document crackling against Thomas's chest when he moved. "Wait," she said. She went to the tin where Bessie kept the kitchen money and pulled out 2 silver coins. "For Pastor Jeremiah. He'll need something for his trouble." Bessie looked up from her soup, meeting Mariah's eyes for the first time that evening. "You be careful, child. Pike's got friends in town who ask no questions." "I will." "And Thomas," Bessie added, her voice soft with something like affection. "Your grandfather was a good man. Surprised me he raised a grandson half as decent." They slipped out the back door, into the storm. Rain soaked through Mariah's shawl in seconds, and mud sucked at their feet as they ran toward the tree line. Behind them, the big house glowed with lamplight, but ahead lay only darkness and the uncertain promise of an old man's conscience, written in faded ink. The night pressed close around them as they made their way toward the church, but Mariah found herself humming the old hymn under her breath. The melody carried better in the rain, threading through the storm like water through stones. Thomas had called her his future wife in front of God and witnesses. Now they would see if God had anything to say about it. Pastor Jeremiah Amos lived in a 2-room cottage behind First Baptist Church, and when Thomas knocked on his door at past midnight, the young minister answered in nightclothes with a Bible in his hand. "Master Bell?" Jeremiah rubbed his eyes, trying to make sense of the soaked figures on his doorstep. "Is there trouble at the house?" "The worst kind," Thomas said. "May we come in?" Jeremiah stepped aside, lighting a second lamp. The cottage was spare but clean. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with books. The storm rattled the window glass. "This is Mariah," Thomas said simply. "I've asked her to marry me." Jeremiah's eyes widened. He was perhaps 25, with serious brown eyes and hands stained with ink from copying sermons. "Master Bell, you know such a union isn't recognized by law. That's why we're here." Thomas pulled the document from his shirt, unfolding it carefully on the table. "Look at this." Jeremiah held the paper to the lamplight, his lips moving silently as he read Judge Bell's faded script. When he finished, he looked up with wonder plain on his face. "This is remarkable. Your grandfather freed Mariah's grandmother?" "For saving my grandmother's life during the fever epidemic," Thomas said. "The document mentions witnesses and a church record. Would your father have kept such records?" "Father kept everything," Jeremiah said. "Church records, civil matters, births and deaths. Said God's work required careful accounting." He moved to a wooden chest in the corner. "If this is real, there should be." He pulled out a leather ledger, its pages thick with years of entries. Mariah watched his finger trace down columns of names and dates, her heart beating so hard she was certain both men could hear it. "Here," Jeremiah said suddenly. "October 15th, 1822. Witnessed the manumission of one Judith, property of Samuel Bell, in consideration of Christian service and mercy rendered. Document sealed and recorded in the presence of Deacon William Hart and Deacon Thomas Crane. Judge Bell declared the manumission binding upon his line in perpetuity." The words hung in the lamplight like a prayer answered. Mariah's grandmother's freedom, written in careful script and witnessed by men of God. "Deacon Hart," Thomas said. "His daughter Mary is the county clerk now. And Deacon Crane's son runs the general store," Jeremiah added. Both families would remember. Outside, dogs began to bay in the distance, Pike's hounds following their trail. "They're coming," Mariah said. Jeremiah moved quickly, copying the church record onto a fresh page with practiced strokes. "Take this, and this." He handed Thomas a small cloth bag. "Communion wafers and wine. If you truly wish to marry, I can perform a blessing now, before God, if not before the law." Thomas looked at Mariah, question plain in his eyes. "A porch blessing," she said softly. "Something my grandmother told me about. When the law won't recognize what the heart knows is true." The dog's baying grew closer. Jeremiah gathered the communion elements and his small Bible. "The church porch. It's covered, and—" he paused, understanding dawning. "A marriage performed on sacred ground, even without legal standing, carries moral weight. If witnesses could be found." "Later," Thomas said. "When it's safe." "No." Mariah's voice was firm. "Now. Before Pike can stop us or ship me downriver. If something happens to me, at least you'll have kept your word." Thomas stared at her, then nodded slowly. "All right." But not just a porch blessing. A real ceremony, with vows spoken proper. They gathered on the covered porch of First Baptist Church, while rain drummed on the wooden roof and lightning illuminated the cemetery beyond. Jeremiah stood with his back to the church doors, Thomas and Mariah facing him with Ephraim as witness. The old stable hand had caught up to them on the road, breathless but determined. "Couldn't let you do this without family present," he'd said to Mariah. "Been like a grandfather to you since you were small." Now he stood with his hat in his hands, while Jeremiah opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved," the young pastor began, his voice carrying over the storm, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief but reverent. Thomas spoke his vows in a clear voice. "I take you, Mariah, to be my wife, to honor and cherish for all my days, before God and in defiance of any law that would keep us apart." Mariah's vows came from her heart. "I take you, Thomas, to be my husband, to stand beside you in joy and trouble, trusting in God's mercy and the truth that love makes all people free." Thomas pulled a gold ring from his finger, his father's wedding band, and slipped it onto Mariah's hand above her blue ribbon. "I pronounce you husband and wife in the sight of God," Jeremiah said. "What the Lord has joined together, let no man put asunder." They kissed while thunder rolled overhead like divine approval. Jeremiah wrote their names in the church ledger. Thomas Samuel Bell and Mariah Judith Freeman, married by porch blessing on the 23rd day of May, 1853, in the sight of God, and witnessed by Ephraim Washington and Jeremiah Amos Freeman. Mariah had taken her grandmother's freed name, the one Judge Bell had given her with the manumission. "It's beautiful," she whispered, looking at the entry. "It's legal," Jeremiah said firmly. "A marriage recorded in church records carries weight in county probate, if the manumission can be proven." Dogs burst from the tree line, Pike's voice carrying behind them. "This way. Tracks lead to the church." "Go," Jeremiah urged. "I'll delay them. The ledger stays locked in the church safe." They ran toward the back of the cemetery, where Ephraim had left an old mule and cart hidden among the cedar trees. As they climbed aboard, Mariah heard Pike's boots pound up the church steps. "Pastor Jeremiah!" Pike's voice was sharp with fury. "Open this door!" The mule lurched forward as Ephraim snapped the reins. They rolled through the cemetery and onto the back road as lamplight bloomed in the church windows behind them. "Where to now?" Thomas asked. "County Clerk," Mariah said, clutching the church record against her chest. "Mary Hart's the only one with authority to verify the manumission seal." "In this storm?" "Pike won't wait for good weather," Ephraim said. "Neither can we." They drove through the night toward town, the mule's hooves splashing through puddles and the cart wheels squelching in the mud. Rain soaked through their clothes and chilled them to the bone, but Mariah felt warm inside her chest where hope had taken root. She was married now, blessed before God, and recorded in the church ledger. The ring on her finger caught starlight when the clouds parted, and her blue ribbon held a husband's promise. Whatever came next, Pike could never say she was just a slave girl again. She was Mariah Judith Freeman Bell, and she had papers to prove it. Dawn came grey and grudging over the county courthouse, its limestone steps slick with rain from the night storm. Mary Hart, county clerk and daughter of the late Deacon William Hart, arrived at her office to find 3 mud-soaked figures huddled under the courthouse eaves. "Master Bell?" She squinted through wire-rimmed spectacles, her dark dress buttoned tight against the morning chill. "Whatever are you doing here at this hour?" Thomas stood, helping Mariah to her feet. The night's flight had left them all hollow-eyed and shivering, but Thomas's voice was steady. "Miss Hart, I need to file a legal document, a manumission from my grandfather's time." Mary Hart was a precise woman of 40, unmarried by choice, and formidable in her devotion to proper procedure. She unlocked the courthouse door and led them into her office, where neat shelves held deed books and marriage registers dating back to the parish's founding. "This is highly irregular," she said, lighting the oil lamp on her desk. "What sort of manumission?" Thomas unfolded the document with careful hands. Mary Hart took it to the lamp, her trained eyes scanning Judge Bell's faded script and the tiny seal pressed into the margin. "This appears to concern," she looked at Mariah. "Your grandmother?" "Judith Freeman," Mariah said. "Freed by Judge Bell in 1822 for saving Mrs. Bell's life during the fever." Mary Hart's expression softened slightly. "I remember that fever. Father spoke of it often, said it carried off nearly half the county before it burned itself out. Your grandmother was a healer? She knew herbs and nursing. Judge Bell wrote that her line would know freedom when the 3rd generation came of age. And you believe yourself to be that 3rd generation?" Mariah nodded, her hand unconsciously touching the gold ring that now sat beside her blue ribbon. Mary Hart noticed the gesture. "That's a wedding ring." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said. "Mariah is my wife, as of last night." Pastor Jeremiah performed the ceremony and recorded it in the church ledger. The clerk's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Master Bell, you understand such a union has no legal standing under state law, which is why we need the manumission verified," Thomas said. "If Mariah was born free, then she's free to marry whom she chooses." Mary Hart set the document on her desk and pulled out a magnifying glass. For long minutes, she studied Judge Bell's handwriting, comparing it to samples in the county records. She examined the seal with particular care, testing its depth with a fine needle. "The hand appears consistent with Judge Bell's other documents," she said finally. "And this seal, it's the old county seal, the one used before 1830. Very difficult to forge, and the impression shows proper depth." Outside, they heard horses approaching at speed. Through the window, Mariah saw Pike dismount from his bay gelding, his face dark with rage. 2 men in patroller uniforms flanked him. "Miss Hart," Pike said, shouldering through the door without knocking. "These people are fugitives. The girl's stolen property, and Master Bell's not in his right mind." "Mr. Pike," Mary Hart said coolly, not looking up from her examination. "This is a county office, not your jurisdiction. You'll wait your turn." Pike's pale eyes fixed on the document in her hands. "What's that paper?" Legal business. None of your concern. Everything on this plantation is my concern. Pike stepped closer to the desk. The girls scheduled for transport this afternoon. Already have buyers lined up downriver. Do you have proper papers for such a sale? Mary Hart asked, her pen poised above a clean page. Pike pulled a folded document from his coat. Freedom, pass. All legal and binding. Mary Hart took the pass, holding it beside Judge Bell's manumission in the lamplight. Mariah watched the clerk's eyes narrow as she compared the two papers. Interesting, Mary Hart murmured. This pass is sealed with rose wax. County seals use sunburst pattern exclusively. Pike's face flushed red. That's the old seal. Still legal, perhaps, but I'll need to verify it against our records. Mary Hart reached for her seal book. If you'll wait outside. I'm not waiting anywhere, Pike snarled. That girl's coming with me now. Actually, Mary Hart said, her voice sharp as winter steel, she's not going anywhere until I've completed my examination. This appears to be a complex matter, involving estate law and manumission records. She dipped her pen in ink and began writing rapidly. I'm issuing a temporary injunction pending investigation. The individual in question will remain in county custody until the matter can be heard before Judge Morrison. Pike's hand moved to his gun. You can't do that. I just did. Mary Hart didn't look up from her writing. The authority of this office extends to all matters of county record. If you interfere with my investigation, I'll have you arrested for obstruction. One of the patrollers shifted nervously. Pike, maybe we should... Shut up, Pike snapped. But his hand moved away from his weapon. Mary Hart finished writing and pressed the county seal into fresh wax at the bottom of the page. The sunburst pattern gleamed gold in the lamplight. There, she said. Official notice of investigation. The hearing is set for 3 days hence, allowing time to examine all relevant documents and call witnesses. She handed copies to Thomas and Pike. Until then, the accused remains under county protection. Pike read the notice, his jaw working like he was chewing nails. 3 days. Then she's mine. Only if your documentation proves authentic, Mary Hart replied. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. After Pike and his men left, Mary Hart turned back to the manumission document. This will require careful research. Judge Bell was meticulous in his record-keeping, but 30 years is a long time. What do you need? Thomas asked. Corroborating evidence. The church record Pastor Jeremiah mentioned would help, but I'll also need to verify the circumstances of the original manumission, medical records from the fever epidemic, if they exist. Testimony from anyone who was present. Dr. Vance was apprenticed to old Dr. Morrison during the fever, Ephraim said. He might remember something. Worth trying, Mary Hart agreed. She looked at Mariah with something approaching respect. You realize what you're attempting? Even if we prove the manumission valid, there will be those who refuse to accept it. I know, Mariah said, but I'd rather face them as a free woman than run as a slave. Mary Hart nodded approvingly. Courage is its own form of proof. Very well. 3 days to build our case. She locked the documents in her safe and gave them a receipt. Keep this with you at all times. It's your protection until the hearing. As they prepared to leave, Mariah turned back to the clerk. Miss Hart, why are you helping us? Mary Hart removed her spectacles and cleaned them carefully. My father was present when Judge Bell freed your grandmother. He said it was the finest act of Christian mercy he'd ever witnessed. If there's a chance to honor that mercy. She replaced her spectacles and met Mariah's eyes. Some things matter more than custom. They walked down the courthouse steps into morning sunlight that slanted golden through the breaking clouds. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and bright. 3 days, Thomas said. Mariah touched her blue ribbon, now intertwined with gold. Then we'd better get started. Doctor. Vance's medical practice occupied the back rooms of Morrison's apothecary on Main Street, the walls lined with glass jars containing herbs and powders from around the world. The elderly physician looked up from grinding willow bark when they entered, his white hair wild from running his hands through it. Thomas Bell, he said, surprise evident in his voice. Haven't seen you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. What brings you to town so early? A question about the fever epidemic of 1821, sir. You were Dr. Morrison's apprentice then? Dr. Vance set down his mortar and pestle. Indeed I was. Terrible time. Lost more patients that summer than in all my years since. His eyes moved to Mariah. Is this about your grandmother, child? Mariah started. You remember her? Remember Judith? Lord, yes. Best nurse I ever worked with, before or since. Had hands that could gentle fever and a way with herbs that seemed near miraculous. He smiled sadly. Saved more lives than I did, if I'm honest. Do you remember the Bell family during the fever? Thomas asked. Your grandmother was near death. Yes. Fever so high she was talking to people who'd been gone 20 years. We tried everything, cold baths, bleeding, mercury. Nothing touched it. Dr. Vance pulled down a jar of dried herbs. Then Judith appeared at the door with a tea made from this, willow bark and elderflower, with something else I never could identify. Did it work? Mariah asked. Within hours, the fever broke. Your grandmother slept natural for the first time in a week. Judge Bell wept like a baby. Dr. Vance replaced the jar carefully. Said he owed Judith a debt he could never repay. He tried to repay it, Thomas said. He showed Dr. Vance the manumission document. Freed her and declared her line would know freedom. Dr. Vance read the paper with growing amazement. Well, I'll be blessed. I wondered why Judith disappeared so suddenly after the fever passed. Judge Bell told everyone she'd been sold to family in Kentucky, but that never sat right with me. He wasn't a man to part with valuable property lightly. Would you testify to what you remember? Thomas asked. Before Judge Morrison? Certainly. Though I warn you, boy, this won't sit well with certain folk. There's money in keeping things as they are. As if summoned by his words, Pike's voice carried through the front door of the apothecary. Check the back room. They might be hiding there. Dr. Vance moved quickly to the window that looked out on the alley behind the building. There's a door to the cellar. Connects to the tunnel system the smugglers used during the War of 1812. Comes out near the river. We're not running, Thomas said firmly. Maybe you should, Doctor, Vance warned. Pike's got friends among the patrollers, and they're not particular about following proper procedure. The front door chimed as heavy boots entered the shop. Pike's voice was closer now. Morrison, where are they? The old apothecary's voice was steady. Where's who? Pike. You're tracking mud on my clean floor. Don't play games with me, old man. The Bell boy and his slave girl. Haven't seen Master Bell in months. Now, if you need something for that persistent cough of yours, Mariah touched Thomas's arm, we should go. No sense involving good people in our trouble. They slipped out the back door and into the alley, where Ephraim waited with the mule cart. As they drove away, Mariah heard Pike's angry voice through the apothecary windows. Dr. Vance will be fine, Thomas assured her. Pike needs the doctor too much to threaten him openly. Where to now? Ephraim asked. The church, Mariah said. Pastor Jeremiah said he'd make copies of the marriage record. We'll need them for the hearing. They drove through town as the morning warmed, past shops opening their shutters and women hanging laundry in neat yards. Several people recognized Thomas and nodded respectfully, but their eyes lingered on Mariah with curiosity and something less friendly. Word was spreading. First Baptist Church sat on a hill overlooking the river, its white steeple gleaming in the morning sun. They found Pastor Jeremiah in the sanctuary, copying hymn verses in careful script. Thomas, Mariah! He set down his pen and hurried to meet them. I was afraid Pike had caught you. Not yet, Thomas said. Do you have the marriage record? Jeremiah produced a folded paper from his jacket. 3 copies, all signed and witnessed. I've also written a statement about the porch blessing and its significance in church law. Church law? Mariah asked. Marriage is a sacrament, Jeremiah explained. When performed by ordained clergy with proper vows and witnesses, it carries spiritual weight regardless of civil recognition. Some judges have accepted church records as evidence of intent to marry. Judge Morrison's a religious man, Thomas said hopefully. He's also a practical one. This case will test both sides of his character. Jeremiah folded the papers carefully. There's something else you should know. I've been visited this morning. Pike? Thomas asked. Worse. Reverend Caldwell from the Methodist Church. He's organizing opposition to your marriage among the clergy. Claims it violates biblical teaching and threatens the social order. Mariah felt her heart sink. How many ministers support him? More than I'd like, Jeremiah admitted, but not all. The Quaker Meeting House has offered sanctuary if you need it, and Pastor Williams at the Tame African Baptist Church says his congregation will pray for you. Sanctuary might become necessary, Thomas said grimly. Pike's getting desperate. As if to prove his point, the sound of horses approached the church at speed. Through the window, they saw a group of mounted men surrounding the building. Pike sat his horse in front, his pale eyes fixed on the church doors. "Back door," Jeremiah whispered. "I'll delay them." But Pike was already dismounting, his boots ringing on the church steps. "Pastor Jeremiah." "I know they're in there." Jeremiah walked calmly to the front door and opened it. "Good morning, Pike. You're welcome to worship with us, though it's not Sunday. Cut the nonsense. Where are they?" "Who?" Pike pushed past Jeremiah into the sanctuary. His eyes swept the empty pews and the altar where morning light streamed through stained glass windows, depicting Christ blessing the children. "You married them," Pike said. "It wasn't a question. I perform many marriages. You'll need to be more specific." Pike's hand moved to his gun. "You know exactly who I mean." "Do I?" Jeremiah's voice remained calm, but Mariah could see his hands trembling. "Marriage is a sacred institution, Pike. I take such ceremonies seriously." "Sacred?" Pike laughed harshly. "There's nothing sacred about a white man degrading himself with a slave girl." From their hiding place behind the altar, Mariah felt Thomas tense with rage. She put a restraining hand on his arm. "Love recognizes no color," Jeremiah said quietly. "Scripture tells us that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female." "Scripture tells us slaves should obey their masters," Pike shot back. "Now, where are they?" "I've told you. I don't know." Pike's eyes narrowed. "Then you won't mind if my men search the premises?" "Actually, I would mind. This is consecrated ground. You have no authority here." "I have the authority of property law and public safety. Stand aside." Jeremiah remained in the doorway. "As a minister of God, I cannot permit armed men to defile this sanctuary without proper warrant." Pike's face flushed red. "Get out of my way, preacher." "No." The standoff stretched taut as a violin string. Pike's hand hovered over his pistol while Jeremiah stood firm, his slight frame seeming to fill the doorway. Finally, one of Pike's men spoke up. "Pike, we can't shoot a preacher in his own church. Folks wouldn't stand for it." Pike's jaw worked furiously, but he lowered his hand. "This isn't over, Jeremiah." "I pray it is," the minister replied. "Violence serves no one." After Pike and his men left, Jeremiah led them out through the vestry to where Ephraim waited with the cart. "That was brave," Mariah said. Jeremiah smiled shakily. "I was terrified. But some things are worth the risk." They climbed into the cart as church bells began to ring across town, the signal for midday prayers. The sound followed them as they drove toward the river, where ferrymen and dock workers might remember stories from the fever years. "2 more days," Thomas said. Mariah nodded, but her eyes were on the road behind them, watching for dust clouds that might signal pursuit. Pike wasn't giving up, if anything. Jeremiah's defiance had only made him more dangerous. But they had allies now. Dr. Vance, Pastor Jeremiah, County Clerk Hart, people willing to risk their standing for the sake of justice and mercy. She touched her blue ribbon, now braided with gold thread from Thomas's ring. Her grandmother's freedom had been bought with mercy. Perhaps hers could be too. The river landing bustled with afternoon commerce, despite the previous night's storm. Flatboats, loaded with cotton bales, waited for the current to carry them downriver to New Orleans, while smaller craft ferried passengers and goods across to the opposite bank. Mariah pulled her shawl up around her face as they approached the dock. Too many people here knew her as Pike's property, and whispers followed their cart like persistent flies. "There." Ephraim pointed to an older black man mending nets beside a weathered fishing boat. "That's Solomon Waters. Been working this river since before you were born, Master Thomas. If anyone remembers the fever years, it'll be him." Solomon looked up as they approached, his dark eyes taking in their unlikely group with careful assessment. "Master Bell. Didn't expect to see you down by the docks." "Mr. Waters," Thomas said respectfully. Solomon was a free man who owned his boat and fishing license, one of perhaps a dozen free blacks in the county. "We're hoping you might remember something from the fever epidemic of 1821. Solomon's weathered hands continued working the net, but his attention was fully focused. That was a terrible time. Lost my first wife and 2 children to that fever. Why, you asking? Thomas gestured to Mariah. Do you remember her grandmother, Judith? Solomon's hands stilled on the rope. Judith, who worked for Judge Bell. Lord, yes, I remember her. Sweet woman, had a way with healing herbs. She, the one, pulled your grandmother through when the fever had her. Do you remember what happened to Judith after the fever passed? Judge Bell said she got sold off to Kentucky, but... Solomon glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. I always wondered about that. Judith had a baby girl she was nursing. Strange for a man to break up a mother and child when the child was still at breast. Mariah's heart began to race. A baby girl. Your mama, I expect. Born the spring before the fever hit. Beautiful child with the biggest brown eyes I ever saw. What made you question the Kentucky story? Thomas asked. Solomon tied off a section of net and reached for another length of rope. Few things. First, Judge Bell seemed different after Judith left. Sadder, like something weighed on his conscience. Second, I never saw a bill of sale recorded at the courthouse, and I kept track of such things had family I was trying to buy free. You watched the courthouse records? Every week. Learned to read just so I could track the sales and maybe find my kin. Judge Bell was meticulous about recording every transaction, but there was never any paper on Judith's sale. Mariah exchanged glances with Thomas. What did you think happened? Solomon looked out over the muddy river, choosing his words carefully. I thought maybe the judge found a way to settle his debt to that woman without calling it what it was. Free papers were dangerous things in those days, still are. Lot of folks would kill to keep such news from spreading. A commotion erupted at the far end of the dock. Pike and 3 patrollers were questioning the ferry operator, showing him something on a piece of paper. Time to go, Ephraim murmured. But Solomon had noticed too. You folks in some kind of trouble? We're trying to prove Mariah's grandmother was legally freed by Judge Bell, Thomas said quickly. We have the manumission document, but Pike's fighting it. Solomon's eyes widened. You found the papers? Yes, sir. Well, I'll be blessed. Solomon stood, his full height imposing despite his advanced years. Always wondered if such papers existed. You need someone to testify to what I remember? Would you? Gladly. Time somebody stood up to Pike and his kind. Solomon's voice carried the authority of a man who'd earned his freedom through decades of careful work and saving. I'll be at that courthouse hearing, and I'll bring others who remember Judith and the fever time. Pike had spotted them now, pointing in their direction as he spoke urgently to his men. Back door of Mattingly's store, Solomon said quietly, connects to the old tunnel system. You can come out near the cemetery. They hurried toward the general store as Pike's boots rang on the dock planking behind them. The store owner, a nervous man named Mattingly, glanced from them to the approaching patrollers with obvious distress. Please, Thomas said, just let us through. Mattingly hesitated, then jerked his head toward the back of the store. Quickly, they slipped through the storeroom to a narrow door that opened on stone steps leading down into darkness. Ephraim lit a candle from his pocket, and they descended into the tunnel system that had once hidden smuggled goods from federal agents. The tunnels were damp and narrow, but they connected most of the buildings along Main Street. They emerged behind the blacksmith shop, where the smith pretended not to notice them climbing out of what appeared to be a root cellar. 2 days, Thomas said as they made their way back to the cart. Mariah nodded, but her mind was racing with everything they'd learned. Dr. Vance's testimony about the fever, Solomon's memories of her grandmother, and the suspicious circumstances of her disappearance, Pastor Jeremiah's marriage record and statement about the porch blessing. They had evidence now enough to make a case, but Pike had resources too, money, connections, and the powerful backing of men who profited from keeping the current system unchanged. The hearing would test more than documents and testimony. It would test whether mercy could triumph over law, whether justice could overcome profit, whether love could defeat the machinery of oppression that had ground on for generations. As they drove back toward town, Mariah hummed the old hymn under her breath, the one her grandmother had taught her, the one that had guided them through the storm. The melody carried on the afternoon breeze, threading through the sound of cartwheels and mule hooves like a prayer set to music. 2 more days to gather what proof they could. 2 more days before Pike made his final move. 2 more days to prepare for the fight of their lives. Rain returned with a vengeance the morning before the hearing, turning the county roads to rivers of mud and forcing travelers to seek shelter wherever they could find it. Maria stood at the window of the Methodist minister's house, the only place in town willing to offer them sanctuary, watching water cascade from overwhelmed gutters. "Bridge is gone," Thomas announced, shaking rain from his coat as he returned from town. "Washed out completely in the night. Judge Morrison can't get back from the capital, and the circuit court's been postponed indefinitely." Maria's heart sank. "Then Pike wins. He'll have me on a boat downriver before the waters recede." "Not if we can help it." The voice belonged to Mary Hart, the county clerk, who entered stamping mud from her boots. "I've been researching emergency procedures for situations exactly like this. County law allows for temporary hearings in cases where delay would cause irreparable harm." "Temporary hearings?" Thomas asked. "Essentially, I can act as magistrate until Judge Morrison returns, provided there are sufficient witnesses and proper documentation." Mary Hart set her leather satchel on the table. "The hearing can proceed as scheduled, with my ruling subject to judicial review when normal court sessions resume." Relief flooded through Maria, followed quickly by apprehension. "Will people accept your authority?" "They'll have to. It's established law." Mary Hart's voice was firm, but Maria caught the uncertainty underneath. A woman acting as magistrate was unusual enough to draw criticism under the best circumstances. A knock at the door interrupted them. Reverend Matthews, their Methodist host, answered to find Dr. Vance dripping on the doorstep. "Doctor," Matthews said, "come in before you catch your death." "Doctor." Vance shed his sodden coat, revealing a leather portfolio clutched against his chest. "I've found something," he announced without preamble, "something that changes everything." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a thin journal bound in cracked leather. "My apprentice notes from the fever epidemic. I kept detailed records of every patient, every treatment, every outcome." Maria leaned forward as he opened the journal to a page marked with faded ribbon. "Here, July 23rd, 1821. Mrs. Elizabeth Bell, fever of unknown origin, temperature estimated at 104 degrees, traditional treatments ineffective." His finger moved down the page. "July 24th. Condition deteriorating. Patient delirious, pulse weak and rapid. Judith recommends herbal preparation, willow bark, elderflower, and what she calls fever root. I object, but Judge Bell insists we try anything." July 25th, Dr. Vance continued. "Fever broke at dawn, patient lucid and breathing normal. Judith's preparation successful where all conventional medicine failed. Judge Bell declares he owes her a debt beyond price." Thomas gripped Maria's hand. "That's contemporaneous evidence. Written at the time, not recalled from memory." "There's more," Dr. Vance said. "August 15th, 1821. Judge Bell privately consults about legal method to free Judith without creating precedent that might endanger other slaveholders. Suggests gradual emancipation through third generation to avoid immediate controversy. He planned it carefully," Mary Hart observed. "Structured the manumission to appear as a future provision rather than immediate freedom." Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, Maria saw lanterns bobbing through the streets as people sought higher ground. The storm was driving everyone indoors, which might work in their favor harder for Pike to organize opposition when people were focused on survival. "Where will the hearing take place?" Thomas asked. "Town hall's flooded," Mary Hart replied, "but the courthouse steps are covered and elevated, if we can gather enough witnesses." "I can guarantee witnesses," Dr. Vance said. "Professional reputation carries weight in this county. People will listen if I vouch for the medical evidence. And I'll bring church members," Reverend Matthews added. "The Methodist congregation may not approve of interracial marriage, but they believe in justice and lawful proceedings." As if summoned by their conversation, heavy boots splashed up the front walk. Pike's voice carried through the door. "Open up. I know they're in there." Reverend Matthews went to the door but didn't open it. "This is private property, Pike. You're not welcome here." "I don't need to be welcome. I've got legal authority to retrieve stolen property." "By whose authority?" Mary Hart called out. Circuit Judge Patterson issued an emergency writ. "The girl comes with me now." Mary Hart's face went pale. Judge Patterson was notorious for his pro-slavery rulings and his financial connections to the plantation system. "Show me the writ," she demanded. Pike slid a folded paper under the door. Mary Hart examined it in the lamplight, her expression growing grave. "It appears authentic," she said quietly. "Signed and sealed by Judge Patterson 2 days ago." Mariah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Then it's over." "Not necessarily." Mary Hart studied the document more carefully. "This writ assumes you're still legally enslaved. If we can prove the manumission valid before you're transported." "How?" "The hearing's not until tomorrow." "Emergency doctrine," Mary Hart said, her voice gaining strength. "Immediate threat to life or liberty justifies immediate judicial review. I'm calling the hearing now." "In this storm?" Dr. Vance asked. "The law doesn't stop for weather." Mary Hart gathered her papers. "Pike's writ gives us 1 hour to present contrary evidence. We use every minute." Pike's fist hammered on the door. "Time's up. Open this door or I'll break it down." "One moment," Reverend Matthews called. He turned to the others. "Back door." "My congregation's gathering in the church basement to wait out the storm, if we can get word to them." "I'll go," Dr. Vance said. "Medical emergency gives me reason to move freely." He slipped out the back as Matthews opened the front door. Pike stood there with 4 men, all armed, their faces hard as winter iron. "Step aside, preacher. This is God's house," Matthews said firmly. "You'll conduct yourself accordingly." Pike pushed past him, his pale eyes scanning the room until they fixed on Mariah. "There she is. Come along, girl." "Wait." Mary Hart stepped between them, her clerk's badge gleaming on her coat. "I'm calling an emergency hearing to examine this writ and related evidence." Pike laughed. "You can't call a hearing. You're just a clerk. County Law Section 47, subsection 12, Mary Hart recited. "In the absence of appointed judges, and in cases of immediate threat to person or property, the senior county clerk may act as magistrate for proceedings not exceeding 2 hours in duration. That's ridiculous. That's the law." Mary Hart's voice carried absolute authority. "And as acting magistrate, I'm ordering you to stand down until this matter can be properly adjudicated." Pike's hand moved toward his gun. "You're overstepping your bounds, woman." "Am I?" Mary Hart produced her own document, an official commission signed by the governor, appointing her as emergency magistrate. This was filed yesterday in anticipation of exactly this situation. Mariah stared at the commission in wonder. Mary Hart had been planning, preparing for Pike's inevitable counterattack. "The hearing convenes in 1 hour at the courthouse steps," Mary Hart announced. "All parties will present their evidence in proper legal order." Pike's face was purple with rage, but he couldn't argue with official documents and legal procedure. 1 hour. Then she comes with me, and all your legal tricks won't save her. After he left, Mariah turned to Mary Hart with gratitude and confusion. "How did you know he'd try this?" "Pike's not subtle," Mary Hart replied. "He's been consolidating his position all week, calling in favors and making threats. Judge Patterson's his trump card, a man who can be bought when the price is right." "And the commission?" "I wrote to the governor the day you first showed me the manumission, explained the situation and requested emergency authority. The governor's a fair man, and he doesn't appreciate slavery cases that challenge legal precedent." Thunder rolled overhead as they prepared to leave. The storm was getting worse, but they had no choice. Pike's deadline left no room for delay. 1 hour to prove freedom or lose everything, Thomas said. Mariah touched her blue ribbon, now permanently braided with Thomas's gold ring. "Then we'd better make it count." The courthouse steps were a scene from biblical tribulation, rain driving sideways under the covered portico, while lanterns swung wildly in the wind. Despite the weather, word had spread through town, and people gathered under whatever shelter they could find. Mary Hart had transformed the top step into a makeshift courtroom, with a table for documents and chairs for witnesses. Pike stood to one side with his men, water streaming from their coats, while Dr. Vance, Pastor Jeremiah, and Solomon Waters represented Mariah's cause. "This hearing is called to order," Mary Hart announced, her voice carrying over the storm. "The matter before us, the validity of a manumission document dated October 15th, 1822, pertaining to one Judith Freeman and her descendants. Pike stepped forward. This is a waste of time. I have a valid writ from Judge Patterson ordering the immediate return of stolen property. Your writ assumes the person in question is legally enslaved, Mary Hart replied. We're here to examine that assumption. She gestured to Thomas. Present your evidence. Thomas unfolded the original manumission document, protecting it from the rain with a cloth cover. This document, written and signed by my grandfather, Judge Samuel Bell, grants freedom to Judith Freeman and declares that her line shall know freedom when the third generation comes of age. The document is 30 years old, Pike objected. Could be forged. Dr. Vance, Mary Hart called. You examined the handwriting? Dr. Vance stepped forward, his medical bag clutched against the rain. I knew Judge Bell personally and have examples of his writing in my medical records. The hand is consistent, and the paper shows proper aging for the date claimed. Furthermore, he continued, pulling out his apprentice journal, I have contemporaneous notes from the fever epidemic confirming Judge Bell's debt to Judith Freeman and his stated intention to repay that debt. He read from the journal entries while rain drummed on the roof. Overhead. Several people in the crowd nodded. They remembered the fever years and the lives Judith had saved. Circumstantial evidence, Pike scoffed. Nothing that proves legal manumission. Pastor Jeremiah, Mary Hart called. Your testimony? The young minister stepped up, rain dripping from his dark hair. The church records show that my father witnessed Judge Bell's manumission of Judith Freeman on October 15th, 1822. The record includes notation of a formal seal and the names of 2 deacon witnesses. And you believe this girl is the third generation mentioned in the manumission? I've examined the genealogical evidence. Judith Freeman was Mariah's grandmother, born free by virtue of Judge Bell's mercy. The manumission clearly states that freedom extends to the third generation. Pike shoved forward. This is all speculation based on old papers and faded memories. I have solid documentation of current ownership and a judicial order for return of property. He produced his freedom pass with a flourish. This girl was legally purchased and is scheduled for lawful transport. End of discussion. Mary Hart took the pass, examining it in the lantern light. Mariah watched the clerk's eyes narrow as she studied the seal and signature. Interesting, Mary Hart murmured. Mr. Pike, can you explain why this pass is sealed with rose wax when county documents use exclusively sunburst pattern? Pike's face flushed. Different seal, still legal, is it? Mary Hart reached for her own seal and pressed it into fresh wax. The sunburst pattern gleamed gold beside Pike's rose-colored seal. The difference is quite apparent. She held both documents up to the lantern light. Moreover, the paper stock is different, and the signature appears to be traced rather than written naturally. A murmur ran through the crowd. Pike's pass was looking increasingly questionable under professional scrutiny. Your document is forged, Mary Hart announced. Crudely forged, in fact. Pike's hand moved to his gun. You can't prove that. Actually, I can. Mariah stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the rain. May I examine the pass? Mary Hart handed her the document. Mariah held it close to the lantern, her trained eyes scanning every detail. The letter form on the B in Bell is wrong, she said. See how the top curve doesn't close properly? County clerks are trained in specific penmanship. This writer learned to read, but never learned proper letter formation. She pointed to another section, and here the date. The ink is too fresh for a document supposedly written last month. It hasn't had time to fade or settle into the paper fibers. The crowd pressed closer, straining to see. Pike's men began to look uncomfortable as the evidence mounted against their leader. Furthermore, Mariah continued, the seal depth is wrong. County seals are pressed with specific pressure to create consistent impressions. This one's too shallow, the mark of someone who doesn't have practice with official documents. Mary Hart smiled with professional approval. Excellent observation. The document is clearly fraudulent, Pike exploded. This is ridiculous. You're taking the word of a slave girl over official papers. I'm taking the word of evidence, Mary Hart replied coolly. Your pass is forged, Mr. Pike, poorly forged, which raises questions about your other documentation. She pulled out a ledger from her bag. I've been researching your sales records, Mr. Pike. Interesting pattern of missing documentation and questionable transactions. Pike went pale. You have no authority to examine private business. I have every authority when those transactions involve fraudulent county documents. Mary Hart's voice was steel. How many people have you sold with forged papers, Mr. Pike? The crowd began to murmur angrily. Pike had always been unpopular, but if he'd been falsifying freedom passes and sale documents. This hearing is about the girl, Pike said desperately, not my business practices. Actually, it's about both, Mary Hart replied, because your credibility as a witness is now destroyed. Why should we believe anything you say about Mariah's legal status? She turned to address the crowd. Based on the evidence presented, the authenticated manumission document, the church records, the medical testimony, and the clear fraudulence of the opposing documents, I rule that Mariah Freeman Bell is legally free and has been since her birth. Furthermore, Mary Hart continued, her marriage to Thomas Bell, performed by ordained clergy and recorded in church registers, is valid under county law. She cannot be sold as chattel because she is not chattel, she is a free woman and a lawfully wedded wife. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. Pike's face was murderous, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. This isn't over, he snarled. Judge Patterson won't stand for this mockery of justice. Judge Patterson will have to review my ruling through proper appellate procedures, Mary Hart replied. Until then, my judgment stands. Pike stalked away into the rain with his men, but not before turning back for one final threat. You'll all regret this. Every last one of you. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas took Mariah's hand. You're free, he said wonderingly. Legally, officially free. Mariah looked down at her blue ribbon, now braided with gold and witnessed by half the county. Free and married, she corrected, and ready to start our life together. Mary Hart approached them, her clerk's badge glinting in the lantern light. The ruling stands until Judge Morrison returns from the Capitol. I expect he'll uphold it. The evidence is overwhelming. What about Pike? Thomas asked. He'll face charges for document forgery and fraud. His days of illegal slave trading are finished. Mary Hart's smile was grim with satisfaction. Justice may be slow, but it arrives eventually. They walked down the courthouse steps together into the storm, but Mariah felt like she was walking into sunshine. The rain washed clean her face, washing away years of fear and uncertainty. She was Mariah Freeman Bell, free woman and lawful wife. The storm had broken, and she had emerged on the other side, whole and victorious. Behind them, the courthouse stood like a monument to justice delayed but not denied. Ahead lay a life she could barely imagine, a life where her choices were her own, and her future was limited only by her courage to claim it. Morning came soft and golden over the Louisiana countryside, the storm's fury spent in the night. Mariah stood in the kitchen of the Bell house, her house now. She reminded herself watching steam rise from the coffee pot, while early light slanted through rain-washed windows. 3 weeks had passed since the courthouse hearing, and life had settled into rhythms both familiar and strange. She still woke before dawn, still hummed her grandmother's hymn while working, but now she did so as mistress of her own fate rather than property of another. You're up early, Thomas said, appearing in the doorway with his hair mussed from sleep. The haunted look had left his eyes, replaced by something approaching peace. Old habits, Mariah replied, pouring coffee into 2 cups. Besides, we have guests coming for breakfast. Mary Hart and Dr. Vance were expected within the hour, along with Pastor Jeremiah and his new wife, a schoolteacher from Baton Rouge, who'd agreed to help establish a small school for the children of freed slaves in the county. The changes had been swift. Once Mary Hart's ruling was upheld by Judge Morrison, Pike had fled rather than face charges, taking with him several plantation overseers whose own record-keeping couldn't bear scrutiny. In his place, Thomas had hired Ephraim as head supervisor, with wages and written contracts for all workers. Not everyone approved. The Harlan faction had made their displeasure known through angry letters to newspapers and pointed snubs at church gatherings. But others had surprised them with quiet support. Dr. Vance's public backing of the ruling carried weight with the respectable merchant class, and Mary Hart's reputation for legal precision had convinced even skeptics that justice had been properly served. "Any word from New Orleans?" Thomas asked, settling at the kitchen table with his coffee. Mariah handed him a letter that had arrived the previous evening. "Mr. Boudreau responds favorably to our proposal. He's willing to purchase the cotton crop directly, cutting out the New Orleans middlemen who've been pressuring other buyers to boycott us." Thomas read the letter with growing relief. The economic warfare had been subtle but real: cancelled contracts, delayed shipments, inflated prices for supplies. But Boudreau was an old friend of Judge Bell's who remembered Judith's kindness during the fever years. "What about the northern textile contracts?" Mariah asked. "Confirmed. 3 mills in Massachusetts have agreed to purchase our cotton at premium prices." Thomas smiled. "Seems our story has spread beyond Louisiana. There are people in the north willing to pay extra for cotton grown by free labor." A knock at the kitchen door interrupted them. Mariah opened it to find Solomon Waters, his weathered face creased with worry. "Morning, Mrs. Bell," he said respectfully. "Sorry to bother you so early, but we got trouble down at the landing." "What kind of trouble?" Thomas asked, joining them. "River patrol boat docked this morning. Captain says he's got orders to inspect all manumission papers in the county. Wants to examine every free black's documentation." Mariah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Federal marshals, state patrol, but they're asking federal questions. Something about the Fugitive Slave Act and false papers." Thomas's jaw tightened. "They're trying to undermine Mary Hart's ruling by questioning the legitimacy of free papers generally." "What can we do?" Mariah asked. "Fight it," Thomas said grimly. "Same way we fought Pike, with law, evidence, and witnesses." Within an hour, their kitchen had become an impromptu war council. Mary Hart arrived with her leather satchel full of legal precedents, while Dr. Vance brought news from town. "Captain Morrison, no relation to our judge, claims he's investigating a pattern of fraudulent manumissions throughout the parish," Dr. Vance reported. "Says too many slaves have been claiming freedom based on questionable documents." "It's a fishing expedition," Mary Hart said bluntly. "They're hoping to find irregularities they can use to challenge the legal framework that freed Mariah." Pastor Jeremiah entered with his new wife Sarah, a serious young woman whose quiet demeanor masked fierce intelligence. "The Methodist congregation is split," he reported. "Reverend Caldwell is supporting the investigation, claiming it's necessary to preserve order. But others are asking whether this is really about law or about intimidating free blacks." "What does Captain Morrison want specifically?" Thomas asked. "He's demanding all manumission documents be brought to the courthouse for expert examination," Mary Hart replied. "Anyone who can't produce papers to his satisfaction will be detained, pending investigation." Mariah touched her blue ribbon, now permanently woven with Thomas's gold ring. "He wants to re-enslave people who've been free for years. That's the goal," Mary Hart confirmed. "Create enough doubt and confusion that any freedom can be questioned. Then we give him no doubt to exploit," Thomas said. "Every document authenticated, every witness prepared, every legal precedent researched." Sarah Jeremiah spoke for the first time, her voice soft but determined. "There's another approach. Public opinion matters as much as legal precedent. If enough people see this investigation as persecution rather than justice." "What do you have in mind?" Mary Hart asked. "A gathering. Public testimony from everyone whose freedom is being questioned. Let the community hear their stories directly, rather than filtering them through legal procedures." Dr. Vance nodded approvingly. "Medical approach: treat the social infection by exposing it to light." "The town square," Mariah suggested. "Tomorrow evening, when people are finished with work, make it impossible to ignore." Thomas stood, decision crystallizing in his expression. "We'll do both. Fight in court and in public. Show them that freedom defended is freedom preserved." The town square at sunset looked like a page from the Book of Revelation. People gathered under torchlight while storm clouds massed on the horizon. Tables had been arranged in a horseshoe pattern, with Mary Hart's Clark Station at the center and witnesses seated according to the decades of their freedom. Captain Morrison occupied a chair beside the courthouse steps, his blue uniform crisp and his expression skeptical. 2 federal marshals flanked him, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "This is highly irregular," Morrison announced as the crowd settled. Legal proceedings belong in courtrooms, not public squares. This isn't a legal proceeding, Mary Hart replied. It's a community meeting to examine the history of manumission in this parish. Perfectly legal and entirely public. She gestured to the first witness. Solomon Waters, freed by purchase in 1831, certificate properly recorded and witnessed. Solomon stood, his dignity evident in every line of his weathered frame. I worked 16 years to buy my freedom, saved every penny, did extra work, sold fish and game to earn the purchase price. When I finally had enough, Judge Morrison, your predecessor, Captain, examined my money and my master's willingness to sell. Everything legal and proper. Who witnessed the transaction? Morrison asked. Dr. Vance and Pastor Amos, both still living at the time. County Clerk Davidson recorded it in the official register. Solomon's voice carried the authority of absolute truth. I got the papers right here, signed and sealed. Morrison examined Solomon's documents with professional care, but found no irregularities. Very well. Next. One by one, the free blacks of the county told their stories. Some had been freed by will, others by purchase, still others through military service or extraordinary circumstances. Each presented documentation, each named witnesses, each defended their freedom with quiet dignity. The crowd listened in growing amazement. Few had realized how many pathways to freedom existed within the legal system, or how carefully freed slaves guarded their precious papers. Martha Washington, Mary Hart called, freed by testament in 1845. An elderly woman rose, her silver hair braided with ribbons. Master Crenshaw freed me in his will for nursing him through his final illness. His family contested it, but the probate judge upheld the testament. I been free 8 years come Christmas. Documentation, Morrison demanded. Martha produced a carefully preserved will and probate decree. Keep them in a cedar box. My husband made special. Never go anywhere without them. The pattern continued through 24 witnesses. Each story was unique, but all shared common elements: careful adherence to law, scrupulous preservation of documents, and the constant awareness that freedom was fragile and required eternal vigilance. Finally, Mary Hart called the name that had drawn the largest crowd: Maria Freeman Bell. Freed by generational manumission dated 1822, marriage to Thomas Bell recorded in church and county records. Maria stood, her blue ribbon catching torchlight as she moved to the witness chair. The square fell silent except for the distant rumble of approaching thunder. Tell your story, Mary Hart said gently. Maria's voice was steady as she recounted the events of the past month. The manumission document found in Judge Bell's papers, the church records supporting the generational freedom clause, the medical testimony about her grandmother's service during the fever epidemic. My freedom isn't new, she concluded. It's been my birthright for 30 years, hidden away and nearly lost, but never invalid. Judge Bell paid a debt of honor to my grandmother, and that debt extends to me. Captain Morrison leaned forward. You claim to be the third generation referenced in this manumission. Can you prove your lineage? I can. Maria had prepared for this question. My grandmother Judith Freeman bore my mother Sarah in 1822, the year of the manumission. My mother bore me in 1834. Church baptismal records document both births. She produced the records, preserved in Pastor Jeremiah's careful script. Morrison examined them with growing frustration. Every detail was corroborated, every claim supported by evidence. Furthermore, Maria continued, there are people in this square who remember my grandmother and can testify to the family connection. I remember Judith, called a voice from the crowd. An ancient woman tottered forward, supported by 2 younger relatives. I'm 94 years old, and I was present when this girl was born. Judith was so proud, said her granddaughter would never know bondage. Other voices joined in confirmation. The community itself was bearing witness, creating a web of testimony that would be impossible to fabricate. Morrison's expression grew increasingly dark as his investigation crumbled under the weight of evidence and community memory. These weren't fraudulent claims, they were meticulously documented assertions of lawfully granted freedom. Captain, Mary Hart said formally, have you found any evidence of fraudulent documentation or false claims among these witnesses? Morrison's jaw worked as he struggled with the answer. The documents appear authentic. Then this investigation is concluded? Thomas asked, from his seat beside Mariah. Not quite. Morrison stood, his hand moving to his gun. There's still the matter of your marriage. Miscegenation is illegal under state law, regardless of the woman's status. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The captain was moving to different ground, not challenging Mariah's freedom, but attacking her marriage. Actually, Sarah, Jeremiah said, rising from her seat with a book in her hands. It's not. All eyes turned to the young schoolteacher. She opened the book, a legal code, and read in a clear voice. Louisiana Revised Statutes, Section 147. Marriage between persons of different races is prohibited when one party is enslaved. The prohibition explicitly depends on slave status. She looked directly at Captain Morrison. Since Mrs. Bell is legally free, no statute prohibits her marriage to a white man. Morrison's face flushed red. That's a technicality. It's the law, Mary Hart said firmly, and this is a legal proceeding, however informal. The marriage stands. Thunder rolled overhead as the first raindrops began to fall. The crowd pressed closer under the courthouse eaves, unwilling to disperse until the confrontation was resolved. Captain Morrison, Mary Hart continued, you've examined 24 manumission cases and found no evidence of fraud or irregularity. Your investigation has achieved its stated purpose. Unless you have specific criminal charges to file, these proceedings should conclude. Morrison looked around the square, taking in the sea of determined faces. His investigation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of undermining confidence in free papers, it had demonstrated the strength and legitimacy of the freed community. Very well, he said grudgingly. But this matter may be reviewed by higher authorities. Any review will find the same evidence we've presented tonight, Thomas said. Truth doesn't change with jurisdiction. As the crowd began to disperse into the rain, Mariah felt a profound sense of completion. Not just her own freedom, but the freedom of an entire community had been tested and confirmed. The investigation meant to destroy them had instead forged them into something stronger. It's finished, Thomas said, taking her hand. Mariah looked around the square, where people were helping each other through the rain, sharing umbrellas and offering rides to those who needed them. Black and white, free and formerly enslaved, all united in the defense of justice and law. No, she said. It's just beginning. 6 months later, Mariah stood on the front porch of the Bell House watching the sunrise paint the Louisiana sky in shades of gold and rose. Her hand rested on the gentle curve of her belly, where new life grew, the 4th generation that would know only freedom. The changes had been remarkable and swift. The school Sarah Jeremiah had proposed was now a reality, meeting in the former slave quarters transformed into bright classrooms. 36 children learned reading, writing, and arithmetic from books donated by Northern abolitionists who'd heard their story. Thomas appeared beside her, coffee in hand and contentment in his eyes. Dr. Vance says everything's progressing normally. He worries too much, Mariah replied, though she was grateful for the doctor's careful attention. Women have been having babies for thousands of years. Not this woman. Not this baby. Thomas's voice held wonder that hadn't dimmed since they'd learned of her pregnancy. Our child will be born free in law and, in fact, with documents to prove it and a community to protect it. The mail coach approached down the drive, its horn announcing the arrival of letters from the outside world. The driver, a friendly man named Jenkins, had become a regular bearer of remarkable news. "Morning, Mrs. Bell," he called, climbing down with his leather satchel. "Got a stack for you today, some from as far away as Boston." The letters told an astonishing story. Their case had been written about in newspapers throughout the North, inspiring other challenges to slavery's legal foundations. Lawyers were using Judge Bell's manumission precedent in courts across the South. Abolitionists were raising money to help other enslaved people document their claims to freedom. "Look at this one," Thomas said, opening a letter with a Massachusetts postmark. "Harvard Law School wants to include our case in their curriculum. They're calling it Bell v. Pike, the power of documentary evidence in manumission proceedings." Mariah smiled, remembering Pike's furious departure after his illegal activities were exposed. The former overseer had fled to Texas, where rumor said he was working as a common laborer, a fitting end for a man who'd profited from others' bondage. "And this," Thomas continued, is from the American Anti-Slavery Society. They're requesting permission to publish your testimony from the town square hearing. My testimony. The part where you identified the forged documents. They want to use it to train people in recognizing fraudulent papers. Thomas's pride was evident. Your eye for detail might help expose other forgeries. Mariah considered the request as she watched the sunrise gild the cotton fields where free laborers now worked for wages and dignity. Her grandmother's gift for observation, passed down through memory and necessity, could serve a purpose beyond their own freedom. Tell them yes, she said, if our story can help others. A rider approached at speed, dust rising from the road. Mariah shaded her eyes against the sun, recognizing Mary Hart's determined posture in the saddle. The county clerk dismounted with unusual urgency. I have news, she announced without preamble. Judge Patterson has been arrested. Pike's ally? Thomas asked. The same. Federal investigation discovered he'd been taking bribes to issue false writs and manipulated documents. His entire judicial record is under review. Mary Hart's smile was fierce with satisfaction. Your case was the thread that unraveled his corruption. The news meant more than personal vindication. Every ruling Patterson had made was now suspect. Every freedom he'd denied subject to appeal. Dozens of people might discover they had legal grounds for emancipation. There's more, Mary Hart continued. The state legislature is considering a bill to strengthen manumission protections and create an appeals process for disputed freedom cases. They want you to testify before the committee. Mariah felt the baby stir within her, as if responding to the momentous nature of the request. Addressing the legislature would be dangerous. Slavery's defenders would fight any legal reforms with desperate fury. But it was also an opportunity to prevent other families from enduring what theirs had suffered. When? She asked. Next month in Baton Rouge. The committee chairman specifically requested your presence, said. Your case represents the best argument for reformed procedures. Thomas took her hand. It's your choice. No one would fault you for staying home and protecting our child. Mariah looked out over the land that was now truly theirs, worked by free hands for fair wages. In the distance, she could hear children's voices from the school, learning to read and write their way to brighter futures. My grandmother saved lives during the fever epidemic, she said finally. If testifying before the legislature might save others from the slavery courts, then that's what she would want me to do. Mary Hart nodded approvingly. I thought you'd say that. I'll accompany you, along with full documentation of your case. We'll make sure they understand what's at stake. As the county clerk rode away and the mail coach continued its rounds, Mariah and Thomas returned to the porch to watch the day begin. Workers were already moving through the fields, their voices carrying snatches of song across the morning air. Are you sure about Baton Rouge? Thomas asked. The travel, the stress. I'm sure. Mariah's hand found the blue ribbon still tied at her wrist, now braided with gold, and soon to be joined by a silver christening bracelet for their child. This baby deserves to be born into a world where freedom means something, where justice is possible and mercy remembered. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of their transformed landscape. Cotton plants stretched toward the horizon, tended by people who owned their own labor and claimed their own wages. Children learned in bright classrooms. Families lived together without fear of separation. It was a small revolution, but revolutions began with single acts of courage. Her grandmother's herbs had saved a life. Judge Bell's conscience had honored a debt. Mary Hart's legal skill had defended the truth. Pastor Jeremiah's faith had blessed forbidden love. And now their story was spreading, inspiring others to challenge the system that treated human beings as property. Change was possible, slow, dangerous, incomplete, but undeniably real. What are you thinking? Thomas asked. Mariah smiled, feeling their child move within her like a promise kept. I'm thinking about the hymn my grandmother taught me, the one about safe harbors and morning light. She began to hum the familiar melody, its notes carrying across the porch and into the day. Thomas joined her, his voice blending with hers as they welcomed the dawn of their new world. In the kitchen behind them, steam rose from the coffee pot and breakfast waited on the stove. Ahead lay the challenges of testimony and childbirth, of building a school and running a farm, of raising a child who would know freedom as birthright rather than gift. But for this moment, they stood together on their own porch, watching the sun rise on their own land, free to choose their own future. The insult that had begun it all, "She's just a slave girl," had become the foundation of a testimony that would echo through courts and legislatures, inspiring others to claim their own freedom and defend their own dignity. Mariah Freeman Bell hummed her grandmother's hymn as morning light painted the world gold, and in that melody was the sound of promises kept and freedom claimed. Love and mercy had conquered law and ledger, and the dawn was rising on a day when all things were possible.